Hello and welcome back to the Bullfrog Podcast, the only Rory Gallagher podcast. Today we jump straight into Rory's life. We talk about his childhood, early influences, his days touring in a show band, the formation of Taste and the lineup change going into their self-titled debut record. If you want to support the show, make sure to follow us on Instagram, sign up for our mailing list via the link in the description and share this with your mates. Enjoy the show. Rory Gallagher was born on the 2nd of March 1948 at the Rock Hospital in Ballyshannon, County Donegal, Ireland, to Daniel and Monica Gallagher. He was baptised at St Joseph's Church nearby. His father, originally from Derry, served in the Irish Army before working for the Electricity Supply Board, ESB, on the construction of Kathleen's Fall hydroelectric power station. This is pretty cool because there's a campsite nearby the power station that facilitates campers and festival attendees every year at the Rory Gallagher Festival in Ballyshannon. My uncle and cousin camped there last year and we spent a great afternoon drinking and passing around the guitar with them. Myself, my dad, my uncle, my dad's friends all had to go playing. I graced the group with a very, very poor version of I Fall Apart, the classic Rory Gallagher song from his debut solo record. Gallagher was initially attracted to skiffle music after hearing Lonnie Donegan on the radio. Donegan frequently covered blues and folk performances from the United States. Rory relied entirely on radio programmes and television. Occasionally, the BBC would play some blues numbers, and he slowly found some songbooks for guitar that revealed the names of the actual composers of blues pieces. While in school, playing songs by Buddy Holly and Eddie Cochran, he discovered his greatest influence in Muddy Waters. He began experimenting with folk, blues and rock music. Unable to find or afford albums, Gallagher stayed up late to hear Radio Luxembourg and AFN, where the radio brought him his only exposure to the actual songwriters and musicians whose music moved him most. Influences he discovered and cited as he progressed included Woody Guthrie, Big Bill Broonzy and Leadbelly. Danny, Rory's father, was also a musician, playing the accordion and singing with the Inishowen Ceilidh Band. Rory's mother, Monica, was involved in the arts, singing and acting with the Abbey Players in Ballyshannon. In recognition of her contributions and her son's legacy, the main theatre of the Abbey Arts Centre was renamed the Rory Gallagher Theatre in 2005. In 1949, the family moved to Derry City, settling at 32 Orchard Row, where Rory's younger brother Donal was born. Donal would go on to manage Rory throughout most of his career. So what I found researching this and diving into this story is that Donal is a very important person in the story and mythology of Rory Gallagher. He was his manager, but more than that, he was his brother, and from reading into their relationship, seemingly his best friend and biggest fan, all in one. The love he felt for his big brother is so apparent in how he speaks about him. In an interview with Donal, in which he reflects on his childhood with Rory, living in Derry, the Taste years, he says, "We were hearing American music at that time because the port of Derry had been given to the Americans. The base had an AFM mast which, in true American fashion, had to be the biggest and the best at that time. So if you turned the radio on, it came through irrespective of what channel. Rory used to get very excited by the jazz hour in particular, and then blues came off the back of that. Parallel to all of this, you had Chris Barber on BBC, where you would have acts like Big Bill Broonzy as guests. At first, Donal actually performed alongside Rory at small social events in Cork, harmonising on songs like Wake Up Little Susie by the Everly Brothers. One night, at St Augustine's Hall, they ran out of material and Rory asked Donal to perform his party piece, The Scottish Soldier. Midway through, Donal hesitated, pointing out that the song didn't have a guitar part, but Rory insisted he continue. While the audience enjoyed it, Rory was furious, considering Donal's hesitation unprofessional. Backstage, he immediately fired his brother, reinforcing his strict approach to stage performance. But while Donal's career as Rory's bandmate ended there, he would go on and live on as Rory's manager. In a great interview with Donal, he speaks so fondly of his brother. I'll link all my citations for the listeners and you can go and read these in your own time and hopefully I don't get anything wrong from copying into them. But in this particular one, Donal says, "There was less than 2 years between us. I was probably 9 and he was 11. After that, he taught me the guitar. He always encouraged me, but it was like having a brother who's an athlete and you can't keep up. He never let me grace the stage with him again. I think anybody would feel pale in comparison to having Rory as a big brother, especially if you were trying to get into music and play guitar, because seemingly from a young age Rory was just gifted and straight into it. But from diving into this story, I've learned just how crucial Donal is to Rory's success and longevity, especially as an artist, arguably more so since Rory's passing. During his time in Derry, Rory attended the Christian Brothers Primary School, known locally as the Brow of the Hill. In 1956, he, his mother and his brother relocated to Cork, where they lived with his maternal grandparents above the modern bar, later renamed Roach's Bar, on McCurtain Street. He continued his education at the North Monastery School and later at St Kieran's College. From an early age, Gallagher showed a natural talent for music. Teaching himself to play the ukulele, he received his first guitar at the age of 9. He soon began performing at small local events and at 12 won a talent contest, using the cash prize to buy a new guitar. By 1963, at just 15, he made a purchase that would define his career, a 1961 Fender Stratocaster bought for £100 from Crowley's music shop. This iconic guitar became his signature instrument and remained closely associated with him throughout his career until this day. We could and we will do an entire episode about this 61 Stratocaster, but to give a little context, Rory's iconic 61 Strat that he bought for £100 on a credit scheme from the owner of Crowley's music store, Michael Crowley. According to the legend, this was the first Stratocaster to ever reach Ireland. The story of how Rory came to own this 61 Strat is somewhat interesting in itself. The guitar's previous owner was Jim Conlon, who is known for being the founder and the guitarist of an Irish show band called the Royal Showband. Jim allegedly ordered a red Stratocaster from the US, but this Sunburst came instead. So he had to use the guitar for around half a year until the red one would arrive. After the red Strat finally got to Ireland, the Sunburst one was put on sale at Crowley's store, who eventually met Rory and agreed to sell the guitar to him in installments. Rory's Stratocaster was modified extensively over the years. Rory's Strat, of course, was shipped from the factory with 3 single-coil pickups, the standard setup for a Fender Stratocaster. It should also be noted that the 61 Strats only feature a 3-way selector, as opposed to the Hendrix-inspired 5-way selector that we're kind of used to nowadays. This would obviously later get upgraded as well. And like I said, there's a whole episode about this guitar and the modifications that Rory did and the changes of it throughout the year. But it's a key part of his legacy on this guitar. And like I said, full episode, we'll get it. You know, it's there, it's coming up next. A lot of people feel particularly attached to it as it's the last remaining bit of him, perhaps. And when Donal announced that the Strat, alongside a range of other instruments from Rory's collection, were to be auctioned, the fan base and community was seemingly unified in that it should be displayed. However, the big debate came in where it should be Ballyshannon, Cork or Dublin. Ultimately, Rory's Strat will be donated to the National Museum of Ireland after it was sold for £700,000, which is approximately €850,000, at a London auction in October last year. A premium placed on the item brought the total up to £889,400, which is approximately €1 million. Minister for Arts Catherine Martin said the guitar has been purchased by Live Nation Gaiety Ltd with a view to donate to the NMI, the National Museum of Ireland, under Section 1003 of the Taxes Consolidation Act 1997. Whatever all that means, probably irrelevant. She said the purchase agreement ensured the guitar would be preserved in the ownership of the state and made available to view for the public and Gallagher fans around the world. And she had this to say: "I'm absolutely delighted that Rory's guitar is coming home to Ireland. My department has been working closely with the National Museum to bring this about. The successful acquisition in association with NMI is hugely welcome." Donal said, "We've been overwhelmed with the response to this auction and the outpouring of love and respect shown towards Rory and his incredible legacy. Rory meant so much to so many people, and we want to thank everybody who took part in the auction and everyone who shared their own memories of Rory with us. It has been nearly 30 years since my brother's passing, and though it was a difficult decision to part with his collection, I'm grateful that these treasured items can now tour the globe as Rory did, spreading his music and memory. We're also delighted that Rory's 1961 Strat will be returning to Ireland, where it can be shared with his fans for generations to come." Like I said, we have a full episode on the guitar and on all the gear that Rory owned and used throughout his years. The myth behind it, the guitar technical geek stuff, all of that is coming. But for now, we're back in 1963. Rory has just got his first guitar, his first electric guitar, the synonymous 1961 Fender Strat, and he has just joined the show band, the Fontana. Rory Gallagher has just joined the Fontana, an Irish show band. Irish show bands were a defining part of Ireland's musical scene from the 1950s to the 1980s, reaching peak popularity in the 1960s. Typically consisting of 7 to 10 members, these bands blended a variety of musical styles, including rock and roll, country, Dixieland jazz, big band, Irish ceilidh, and folk. They were known for their energetic performances, often incorporating comedy skits and choreographed routines. Show bands were a major source of live entertainment in Ireland, performing at ballrooms and social clubs across the country, and later touring internationally in Britain, the US, Canada, and Germany. The roots of the show band movement can be traced back to the big bands in the 1940s and 50s, which focused on instrumental dance music. As musical trends shifted and vocalists became more central to performances, these orchestras downsized, leading to the emergence of show bands. Their ability to cover contemporary chart hits and engage live audiences made them extremely popular with groups like the Miami Show Band, the Dixies, Big Tom, and the Mainliners, achieving widespread success. Many musicians from the show band era later pursued solo careers or formed new groups, leaving a lasting impact on Irish music. However, by the late 1970s and early 1980s, the show band era began to decline. The rise of discotheques and DJs who could play original recordings of hit songs rather than live covers reduced the demand for show bands. Changing musical tastes also played a role as rock bands and emerging pop acts gained more mainstream appeal. Additionally, the Troubles in Northern Ireland made touring difficult and sometimes dangerous, discouraging bands from performing in certain areas. As a result, many show bands disbanded, and the ballroom scene that had supported them faded. Despite their decline, Irish show bands remain an important part of the country's musical heritage, remembered for their role in shaping Ireland's entertainment culture. So show bands played a pivotal role in Irish entertainment, performing energetic live shows that often included choreographed routines. They toured extensively across Ireland, and as their popularity grew, ventured into international markets. Their ability to cover chart-topping hits and engage audiences made them a significant cultural phenomenon during their heyday. I know my grandparents talk a lot about the show bands and their fond memories of them. I think they even went to a show band gig not that long ago, so I think there is still some kind of tribute or presence to these show bands that would tour often enough and sort of maybe be an event that people from that era would go to and have fun at. So Gallagher was eager to form a band but struggled to find like-minded musicians in Cork. In the summer of 1963, while searching through local newspapers, he discovered an advertisement from brothers Oliver and Bernie Tobin, who were looking for a lead guitarist for their newly formed group, the Fontana Show Band. The six-piece band, which played popular hits at the time, included Bernie Tobin on trombone, Oliver Tobin on bass, John Lehane on saxophone, Eamon O'Sullivan on drums, and Jimmy Flynn on guitar. Gallagher impressed them at his audition and quickly secured the position. Soon after, Flynn left by mutual agreement, and Declan O'Keefe joined as rhythm guitarist. The band performed in ballrooms and dance halls across Ireland almost every night, often playing for 5 to 6 hours per show. This constant gigging allowed Gallagher to earn enough to keep up with the payments on his Fender Stratocaster. During Lent, when public dances were prohibited by the Catholic Church in Ireland, the band toured Great Britain to maintain their performance schedule and keep the money coming in. Although the Fontana Show Band didn't play the kind of music Gallagher truly loved, he viewed it as an important learning experience. Over time, he began to influence the band's setlist, gradually shifting it away from mainstream pop and introducing Chuck Berry songs. By 1965, he had successfully transformed the band into The Impact, now featuring Michael Lehane on keyboards and Johnny Campbell replacing O'Sullivan on drums. Oliver Tobin went on to play in many more bands, including the Irish Freedom Fighters, the Big Four, and the Sailors. In 2010, he wrote a book called A Star Was Born in My Brother's Band, about his years in the music scene and his time playing with Rory. At the time he published the book, he was living in St Patrick's Community Hospital, Fermoy, suffering from Parkinson's. He sadly passed away in 2021. An extract from his book details how Rory was using a Vox AC30 on the show band tours. Anyone who is knowledgeable in Rory's gear will know that this is a key component in his sound and live rig. I wasn't sure when he started using Vox amps, but it seems from very early on, way before Taste, he was using a Fender Stratocaster and a Vox amp. That's kind of what I would say is the signature Gallagher sound. So the same extract talks about the band members of the band going to see the Beatles while in Madrid on tour. And I believe this was at the time the band were going as The Impact, so it was that sort of second iteration, if you want to call it, of the Fontana Show Band. And it's kind of crazy to think of Rory Gallagher touring in a show band and then going to see the Beatles in what would have been referred to as their club days. But we'll talk about that just a little bit quickly. 1965 is a significant year for music history. Fender was sold to CBS for 13 million US dollars. It is considered by some as a bit of a dark era for the company, and guitar enthusiasts, as the brand shifted away from from high quality products to mass production and income, I suppose they just sort of blew up in popularity with that shift in culture and shift into rock and guitar music. The Beatles won the Best New Artist Award at the Grammys. Keith Richards, inspired by the then modern invention of fuzz guitar pedals, wrote Satisfaction while on tour with the Rolling Stones. In this same year, in July, Bob Dylan famously went electric at Newport. The recently released biopic called A Complete Unknown, starring Timothée Chalamet, showcases this event brilliantly and very dramatically. But it was a shift in pop culture. The Beatles sold out Shea Stadium, the first gig to be held in a venue of this size with a capacity of 55,600 people. The Beatles released 2 albums this year, Help and Rubber Soul. Rubber Soul has been on numerous occasions named as the greatest album of all time. Its significance and claim to this title largely come in its milestone in the Beatles story. The first album that wasn't tied to a film or rigorous touring. It was their first experimental album, largely described as a folk rock record. The album showed a new, mature Beatles and became closely linked with the growing music scene in San Francisco, ultimately influencing the Summer of Love. Brian Wilson states that this record is what inspired him to make Pet Sounds. The playful and friendly rivalry between Brian Wilson and Paul McCartney was born. Jumping ahead just a little, this baroque pop and folk rock sound is something I hear heavily in the 2 Taste albums, so I think Rory Gallagher was definitely influenced by this era in music history and by these albums that were coming out. And it's crazy how I always just kind of labelled Rory as a blues musician before this, and while at his core he is, his music draws inspiration from a range of things and range of genres at the time and throughout his career, and seemingly pushes what you would maybe just call blues rock. But I wanted to show the importance of this here because, as Bob Dylan beckoned, the times they were changing. He had gone electric, rock music was the thing, gone was the clean pop standard era of music, and the electric guitar was the new normal. Rory Gallagher knew this with the impact. He transformed a show band to venture into this new sound, this harder blues-inspired guitar-based music, drawing on Rory Gallagher's childhood love of Leadbelly and Muddy Waters. By early summer 1966, the impact had dissolved, and Rory had returned to Ireland. A seasoned touring musician, he briefly performed with a power trio called the Fendermen. This was the name that they were billed as upon request by their former showband manager, Neil Crawford. So whether this was a band name or just a sort of on-the-spot name, it's kind of hard to say. But it was after the dissolution of the Impact and the Fendermen that Rory stepped in as the singer-guitarist of local Cork rock band The Axles. It was then, in 1966, that the Axles bass player, Norman Damery, and Eric Kitteringham, the drummer, then formed the R&B power trio Taste. The band was formed inside the Long Valley Bar, with the name Taste inspired by a beer mat boasting the superior taste of Beamish Stout. Initially called The Taste, but quickly shortened to just Taste. The band began rehearsing on the upper floor of 5 Park View, where the Kitteringham family lived, and made their debut on the 10th of September in 1966 at a school dance held at the Imperial Hotel on Grand Parade in Cork. Rory was only 18 at the time. What's crazy is the level of skill he shows in the next 4 years, closing out the 60s. Not only the very emotive and technically brilliant guitar playing, but his songwriting and musicianship is showcased amazingly in these years. And going into this podcast, I was always very aware of Rory Gallagher, the guitarist, and less so of him as a prolific songwriter. But listening to his music, and with this intensity, I'm getting a much greater appreciation of his general musicianship and skill. Looking to expand their reach to Belfast's blues scene, they performed at the city's Sammy Houston's Jazz Club on Great Victoria Street in December 1966. Their performance caught the attention of promoter Eddie Kennedy, who signed them to a residency at the Maritime Hotel. Donal remembers Eddie and says of him, Kennedy's reputation from the time is somewhat of a curate's egg, and Donal Gallagher describes him as being both sweet and sour. Elaborating, he explains both the good and the bad of a man who would have a massive impact on Rory and shape the future of Taste. He had a good venue, he had good contacts, his reputation went ahead of himself. The guy who carries the cricket bat and Spinal Tap is based on Eddie, because that's what he did. He carried a cricket bat. But he was also a ballroom dancer, laughs Donal. You couldn't invent a guy like him. You wouldn't cross him, put him that way. There you have it, a Rory Gallagher reference in Spinal Tap. That's pretty crazy. In the early 1960s, Belfast nightlife largely consisted of a number of licensed cabaret clubs with genteel pianists and singers and an array of sedate ballrooms where smart-suited showbands pounded out cover versions of the latest top 10 hits. But in April 1964, in the aftermath of the popular music earthquake triggered by the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, a Spartan Seamen's hostel in College Square North, Belfast, which had formerly been a Royal Irish Constabulary police station, transformed into Club Rado, a new rhythm and blues movement in the city, was inaugurated. A group called Them, sporting long hair and unkempt casual clothing, was in the vanguard of this new musical phenomenon, and within weeks of its opening, long queues of fashionably dressed teenagers formed outside to ensure that they got into this 200 capacity hall to enjoy the throbbing music. The Maritime is still celebrated and renowned for nurturing the world-class talents of Van Morrison, the lead singer of Them. There, his early iconic songs such as Gloria and Mystic Eyes were given their first airings, often at improvised length, with their punchy style whipping the dancing crowd into a buzzing frenzy. It was during one of these performances that the Decca Records scout decided to sign the band up, paving the way for them to score several top 10 hits, including Baby Please Don't Go and Here Comes the Night, before Morrison departed to launch his own outstanding international career as a best-selling artist in his own right. So my dad and I actually saw Van Morrison recently and I was blown away. I knew enough of his hits, none of which bar the song Gloria by Them he played the night that I saw him, but he was brilliant. And the band he had up with him were outstanding. I imagine the Maritime Bar feeling a bit like that gig, just kind of top class musicians packed onto a stage. Now the hall was packed, but it was seated. And I from a look around the room, I'd say a lot of the people that were in that room might remember the Van Morrison gigs in the Maritime Hotel. But you know, I can get the long improv and kind of jam based nature of his performances then from what I saw, and I had no idea that that's kind of what he was like live until recently. So I'm pretty into that now, and it was just a really cool gig to go to. So around this time, we start to see other significant names pop up. During the next 2 years, 1966 through to 1968, Taste appear on bills with everyone from Cream to Fleetwood Mac to T-Rex, who were then going as Tyrannosaurus Rex, Jethro Tull, John Mayall's Bluesbreakers, Yes, Pink Floyd, Deep Purple, Blind Faith, and many, many more. According to Donal, while speaking about Eddie Kennedy and his tenure managing Taste and handling bookings for the blues scene in Belfast, Eddie was then bringing over bands like The Move and Peter Green's Fleetwood Mac, John Mayall, Cream. These bands, to come to that part of Ireland, would be there for 3 or 4 days because of the economics of taking a ferry to make it worthwhile. The guys used to enjoy their time. It was like a mini holiday to them, and they were well looked after. Taste were paired up with whoever the visiting band were because a lot of the names would be better known. A lot of these names would be known by the Belfast devotees, but they wouldn't have a broader following. Taste had a good reputation, and they were good for 400 people. And Cream, for example, would be good for 400 people, so you'd have 800 people and the buzz. You had a good double bill that people would turn out for. It gave Rory and Taste a good rapport with the other musicians because they would hang out. It was a very good springboard to get to London. Between 66 and 68, you could have seen Peter Banksy at Yes, Cream at their prime, Peter Green's Fleetwood Mac, and Rory Gallagher on his rise, all on the same bill. It's kind of surreal to think about. And I think there's a bit of a lesson to be learned in this. It's that the next biggest or the next best act, or maybe even your next favourite band, could be out there supporting someone else. I kind of liken this to Inhaler. They've been getting bigger and bigger yearly with every release. I saw them supporting Blossoms back in 2018. They were first on just before another great band from Ireland called Touts, a punk band who did a fantastic cover of Them's Gloria. I wouldn't have listened to either band had I not gone to the gig. And same goes for Wonder Horse supporting Fontaines DC in Galway in 2022. They're huge now and on their way to being huge in their own regard. So I guess what I think is important is to be open to more gigs and different artists. Don't be afraid if you don't immediately love them. Keep in mind at this point in Rory Gallagher's career, he had 0 albums released and wasn't maybe the most mainstream adjacent artist on the scene. So go out and listen to whatever music you can. The link to the website I'm getting all these gigs and bills off is included in the description and will be on the socials as well, so check it out. But as Taste became more and more popular in Belfast, new opportunities presented themselves. They began to build a strong reputation in London at venues like the Marquee, the Lyceum and the 100 Club, as well as across the rest of the UK, where they shared the bill with bands like Cream, Jethro Tull, Fleetwood Mac. The opportunity to record a demo in the studio presented itself in July of 1967 when the company Solomon Perez, who were the biggest record distributors in Northern Ireland, offered their studio to Taste. Unfortunately, what at first appeared to be a big break for the band would lead to problems in the longer term. So it was set up that Taste would record a couple of demos in Bond Street, London. The songs recorded were rough versions of Blister on the Moon and Born on the Wrong Side of Time, the intention being that the Solomons and Eddie Kennedy could get these singles into the hands of Decca, who had previously signed Van Morrison's band Them. The Solomons had become part managers of Taste, causing tensions and rows with Eddie Kennedy. There was one final gig with the original lineup in August at Romano's Ballroom, Belfast. Eddie Kennedy broke the news to Rory that Eric and Norman had to go. Donal, who by that time was the band's road manager, recalls what happened. That came about because Polydor had come to see the band and they recorded a demo for Polydor at the Marquee Studios. People at the Marquee were very generous, with Chris Barber being co-owner of it. Chris was very fond of Rory and they got some downtime in the afternoon to audition for Polydor. What came back, through the manager, was that Polydor wanted to sign them, but with different drummer and bass player. Kennedy at the time was also managing another band called Cheese, which was in decline. The bass player and drummer were Richard McCracken and John Wilson. They were both fine musicians, and John had a bit more experience in terms of recording, having previously played with them. But it was given to Rory as an ultimatum. It's a delicate issue when dealing with things like this in a band, and from my reading it is clear that Rory and the guys were really good friends, and each was important in bringing Taste to the masses. Donal continues, "In the meantime, Blister on the Moon had come out as a single on Major Minor, without any agreements or anything signed, so Rory was locked into the manager to get this situation straightened out. The manager was saying, well, we need to get on another label, and if you want that, Polydor will stop Major Minor. So Rory was backed into a corner. It had never crossed Rory's mind to have actively gone out and recruited new members. And when I look back to when Rory did switch the band to the two Ulster guys, it wasn't a case of looking for anybody else. It was a case of, here are these two guys that are coming into the band, and the other two guys are on their way out. It may seem a tad cutthroat, but I can't fault Rory, Donal, or even Eddie for this move, really. It's not an easy thing to accept, I'm sure, for Eric and Norm, but Rory was just this raw talent, a force of nature, and had a vision that he had to pursue, and he was backed into a corner in order to achieve that, so he had to go through with it. Donal also goes on to say, I remember one night in Birmingham doing a club. Rory and the band had been switched and rehearsed for a week in Belfast before they came back over, and at Birmingham there was a warm-up gig and John Bonham turned up, and John was really upset with Rory and said, Rory, you could have given me an audition. Rory knew John because he was the drummer for Tim Rose and they'd done a lot of gigs together. John came and Rory said, you've just landed a gig with Led Zeppelin, what are you worried about? But John said, I know, but I would have liked to audition. Imagine an alternate world where John Bonham was with Rory Gallagher's drummer. I think Rory could have gone a much heavier rock route and at the same time had maybe got that founder of metal status that Led Zeppelin and Sabbath garnered. It's crazy to think about, but imagine Taste with John Bonham on drums. It would be a heavier band for sure. So Taste was transitioning into its second iteration and its second lineup. The official Rory Gallagher website states that in 1968, Taste moved to London when Kennedy secured a residency for them at the Marquee Club. The band's raw sound made an immediate impression on both critics and fellow musicians, with John Lennon telling a New Musical Express writer, I heard Taste for the first time the other day and that bloke is going places. However, when Polydor showed interest in signing them, Kennedy insisted on replacing Damery and Kitteringham, citing the label's concerns. Despite initial resistance from Gallagher, the rhythm section was replaced by drummer John Wilson and bassist Richard McCracken, both experienced musicians from Belfast. I found a great interview with Donal Gallagher on the transition from the original lineup to the second lineup and signing with Polydor, and I'll summarise it as best I can, but it's definitely worth reading the article. Some other information regarding Rory's recollection of this time I've got from an interview in 1980 with Rory. He details a lot of his early days from the Fontana Show Band to the Impact days, and he talks about both lineups of Taste, and then he talks about his live bands throughout the 70s, so it's very much worth reading and it'll be linked. So Taste's new lineup signed with Polydor, with with Kennedy promising the band that the label would allow them the kind of independence The Who and Cream were then enjoying. What he didn't tell them was that as they were minors, the legal age for contracts back then was 21. It was Kennedy who was signed to Polydor, while the members of Taste were individually under contract to him as employees. Not that the band paid any attention to the intricacies of contracts, preferring to concentrate on taking their music to the people. Taste settled into 2 Earl's Court bedsits, with Rory and Donal sharing one. 2 single beds, a closet, a cooker, a wash basin, and Wilson McCracken in the other. The band toured in an old Ford Transit van, playing wherever they were booked. Our diary was always quite full because we didn't mind going up to Inverness one night and Plymouth the next, both for low money, Gallagher told Zigzag magazine when asked about his early days with Taste. It was the only way to establish ourselves as far as we were concerned, because people soon forget what they read in a paper, but they rarely forget a gig, so we just gradually worked our way up. Donal discusses on sharing with his brother that he had to endure Rory as he taught himself saxophone. He recalls, Rory taught himself to play alto sax in 1 week. He did it in our bedsit in Earl's Court. It was a friggin' nightmare. He ended up playing into our closet, using it as a sound booth. It got so many complaints from other residents of the building. This is hilarious because I've heard my sister learn woodwind instruments and they're loud and sound incredible, but in that learning phase, or even an experienced woodwind performer like my sister, running scales, exercises, and the same for any instrument really, not just limited to woodwind, it's just not a pleasant sound. And I love the thought of Rory Gallagher, this guitar virtuoso, torturing his brother in that tiny London bedsit with the saxophone. But it paid off, as we will touch on shortly, and Rory became a fantastic sax player, and a very underrated sax player at that. Donal also recalls that in winter, the laundry basement was the warmest room in the building, so they would huddle down there, and Rory found it was the place he could even practice guitar and saxophone without annoying other people living in the building. If I lived there, I'd have been doing my laundry every day just to hear Rory practice. And at that, the Earl's Court And at that time, Earl's Court was such a hub for musicians. One of the craziest stories I found was that Brian May's Smile was based here as well. If you've seen the biopic, Bohemian Rhapsody, the band that Freddie Mercury forms Queen with is Smile. And as for their releases, these are few and far between, aside from some bootlegs. They are somewhat pale in comparison to Queen's eventual discography, but you'd expect that from Brian May's teenage band. Their track, Doing Alright, that was in the movie, is pretty great though, I'm a fan of that. The group included Tim Staffel as the lead singer and bassist, and later drummer Roger Taylor, who also went on to play for Queen. The band lasted only 2 years, from 1968 to 1970. Staffel departed in 1970, leaving the band with a catalogue of 9 songs. Brian would come and see Taste all the time. He would hang around after the gig was finished to talk to Rory about guitar, and Rory would explain to him how he got certain sounds. Brian May was always vocal on how Rory Gallagher inspired his sound and playing, even down to a selection of a cranked Vox AC-130 on stage. As Taste's live reputation continued to grow, Polydor were determined to get them into the studio and hired Tony Colton, a highly touted British singer-songwriter who was, at the time, fronting Heads, Hands and Feet as a producer. And I will get back to Tony Colton when we get to the end of Taste and see where all the people and characters in the wake of their breakup end up. But all of the bands and artists I've stumbled across in these years of Rory's career, Tony is one that I really enjoyed. Taste's self-titled debut album was recorded at Delane Leia Studios in August 1968 in 1 day. The next day was devoted to mixing the album, and I can't find a lot of information on the studio time for this album or studio sheet notes or anything like that. So if anybody has anything else they can share about it or any insight, please reach out to us and let us know. Following the recording sessions of Taste's self-titled debut record, they embarked on the Cream farewell tour, a somewhat passing of the torch from one power trio to another. The myth is that on this tour, Rory was offered the chance to replace Clapton and Cream. Although I can't find too much more on this, it is completely within the realms of possibility, as Rory was friends with Ginger Baker, having played with him before, and again he will play with him in the coming years. The self-titled record came out in April 1969 in the UK and July 1969 in the US.